Hi, welcome to Game Analyze. I'm Auna. Today, I'll continue with the Game Ideas series. This episode is about relations between the world and its mechanics and the enemies in your game. So let's start. First, I'll specify what a mechanic is for me in this video. We'll simplify it. A mechanic, for now, will be everything interactable in the world of the game and every interaction that there is. And now for the ideas. As the first one, I'll repeat what I said in the previous episode of this series. You could make an enemy more relation to your world by making it thematic. So, for example, making variations for different biomes or creating exclusive ones for a specific zone. These changes could be only aesthetic or could be also a turn in the own attacks of the enemy. Next, a short one. If you have obstacles and dangerous things in your game, profit from them for enemies too. Anything that kills the player should kill an enemy. You can take this to a mechanic where an enemy attack kills his own comrades, like sword attacks or gunfire. This could also evolve to a puzzle where you can't kill an enemy yourself, but instead you've got to profit from an environmental element to kill him. The most visible example of this would be the well-known red barrels in video games. So let's move on. Another way to improve the relations between mechanics and enemies is using a learned move or original minigame you saw earlier to beat an enemy. This could also be thematic, where you use a mechanic throughout a whole section and use it for the boss of the zone level as a demonstration of the player understanding. If you do not want a little boss, you could use a hard puzzle or a challenge. I'll put two examples for this one. One of them is the Zelda temples, where you use a new item to progress through the place, to end with a boss that you can only beat with the new item. The other example will be an invented one, though. I'm sure it's already been used somewhat. The example is to use some kind of button mash minigame, like a pushing something with brute force like in God of War. Later in the game, a boss or mini-boss carries this to an extreme point, where it's really tough to do it. This way, a player that played the minigame frequently is recompensated with an easier time with the boss. Obviously, this is a really raw and undeveloped mechanic, but I'm sure someone gets a really good idea from this. So now for the next one. Let's now relate enemies with objects. There are a couple of ideas to be taken from this one. For starters, you can use one of the most known mechanics for enemies, the currency system. This means killing an enemy gives you money or the corresponding currency. This is a really known and even obvious one, but we can take it a step further. We can make the currency visible on the enemy, like an enemy that has a physical bag of money, which is less used but still pretty extended. Or making an enemy out of the currency itself, like a golden redraw of the enemy or a literal mash of money that takes shape of an enemy and attacks. You could even make the remains of the enemy sellable instead of using directly money. Another variant of the idea is using objects and items instead of currency. An enemy could give you his armor or weapon, or even his skin, like in Prototype. You could also relate an object to the enemy, like for example how Pokemon uses Pokeballs to trap the creatures. Another example is using steak to distract wolves so they don't attack you. And you could even turn it on its head and using enemies for items, like for example loot of the own enemy, like fur from an animal, or its head as a trophy. Let's change topics a bit. You could make the enemy use the items around himself for his advantage, cinematic situations, or just quotidian tasks. First, advantages. The easiest example is an enemy getting his arrow lit by a bonfire on purpose to do more damage. If possible, you could even make different kinds of arrows, giving an enemy a set amount of each of them, and making an AI that uses the best arrow for each situation. Then letting the player know when they are out of that specific kind of arrows and changing to the next. If an enemy runs out of arrows, he moves on to melee attacks. Now let's move on to cinematic situations. This one mostly depends on enemy placement on the world. The first example that comes to my head is putting the enemy on top of a castle wall, making him an archer, and creating a situation where the player feels defenseless in front of an army or intimidated by them, but ends up beating the challenge and feels incredibly strong and satisfied. This forced cinematic shot is what I want to express with the example. And after that, quotidian tasks. If your enemies somewhat resemble a real creature on Earth, then the creature should eat. This could be an idle animation, a relation between the enemy and the world by it going to a specific species of plants, for example, which could then be used for traps, or in the case of humans, being a whole routine by hunting, making a bonfire, cooking and eating. This routine gives the player something cyclic that they can manipulate. For example, a player wouldn't want to attack the enemy or enemies while they are hunting, as that means they have weapons. You could even allow the players to steal the hunting weapons so they can't eat and get weaker, whilst also leaving the enemy defenseless. A quotidian task cycle is really useful, as it gives the player a pattern to work with, but not making the pattern itself really obvious. Next, you can have spontaneous relations. Two factions meeting each other and fighting, or an enemy collecting a helling earth for the fight would be good example. Both are unplanned situations to a certain extent, thus the reason of them being spontaneous. These relations give life to your world, making it more realistic and interesting. A variant of this could be situations where the enemy just reacts to something, like an open door where there shouldn't be an open one, or scaring off an animal while going in their direction. So, those were all the mechanics I could come up with for you. I feel like a lot of good ideas can be taken from this video. My main objective was to help you improve your enemies and incentivize the use of the environment for that purpose, making your enemies more realistic. But anyways, I'm Auna, and this has been Game Analyze. Game Analyzed.